Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends. Welcome to this June 24, 2015 edition of Nightcast. Our opening story tonight, we go to Europe regarding Greece. Eurozone finance ministers have cut short a meeting which was meant to finalize a financial agreement. The BBC's Damian Grammaticus reports.
It's yet another chance for a deal that has slipped away. Europe's finance ministers, hoping to put this crisis behind them, achieved little today, leaving Greece one day closer to default.
We've not reached an agreement yet, but we are determined to continue work. This work will go on during the night, if necessary, and we will reconvene. So we've now adjourned the meeting and we will reconvene at 1 o'clock tomorrow.
From early, the omens had not been good. The head of the IMF, who helps control the purse strings, arrived dissatisfied with the deal Greece had offered, still demanding more of its prime minister. The decisions Alexis Tsipras is now making are critical ones for his own political future, for Greece and its 11 million people, and for all the nations that use the euro. He has just hours left to make his choices and decide how this crisis will play out. He complained tougher demands are being made of Greece than were of other crisis-hit countries like Ireland or Portugal. Greece has offered to put up taxes on businesses and higher earners. The lenders say it needs to make cuts to pension benefits, to tax breaks for farmers and those who live on the Greek islands, and put up VAT on restaurant meals and hotel stays. In Athens, they were waiting for an outcome tonight. I trust Tsipras. He's doing a good job, she says. He's going to have to do a deal anyway, he adds. Time has been wasted. Greece has been humiliated. And Italy's Prime Minister today warned Athens' brinkmanship is alienating others in Europe.
The Greeks and the Greek government have to understand, and we say this as their friends, that there is tremendous pressure from public opinion in Europe, particularly in some countries, to use this as a window of opportunity to eject Greece from the Eurozone.
So tonight in Brussels, Greece is still facing off with its creditors, demanding relief from its debts, even as time runs out. Damian Grammaticus, BBC News, Brussels.
Mr. Tsipras said Greece's creditors may not be interested in a deal. Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has held intense talks with international creditors in an effort to find a solution to Greece's debt crisis. Mr. Tsipras has criticized lenders for rejecting his latest reform proposals, which the creditors say, are not viable. Late-night talks with the European Commission, the European Central Bank, ECB, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, ended, as you just heard in this opening video, without agreement. Greece must pay the IMF 1.6 billion euros, that'd be the equivalent of 1.1 billion pounds, within days, or face default. Talks in Brussels between Mr. Tsipras and Greece's creditors are expected to resume at 9 o'clock. There'll be 7 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time tomorrow, ahead of a Eurogroup meeting of Eurozone finance ministers scheduled for 1 o'clock in the afternoon or 11 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time. They hope to cut a deal that would release further loans to Greece before it runs out of money. Earlier today, finance ministers cut short a meeting that had been meant to finalize a deal. Mr. Tsipras held several hours of talks, but officials said there was little sign of a breakthrough, with differences over whether the reform plan should have an emphasis on tax rises or pension and spending cuts. The negotiations reconvened tonight into the evening, but again ended without a deal. Now, friends, I've got an analysis from the BBC's Chris Morris from Brussels. He says the Greek government may think it has given significant ground in its latest proposal. The creditors appear to be saying, think again. So, the mood goes from bad to good and back again. In terms of absolute numbers, the distance between the two sides is not huge, but the political gulf is significant. And Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras is caught between a rock and a hard place, between the promises he made to his voters back home and the commitments the creditors insist he must respect. But these negotiations aren't just about budget targets. The Greeks are also demanding that there has to be serious discussion of debt restructuring. On that issue, there is more sympathy from the IMF, but there is less from the European Central Bank and several Eurozone countries. Only once agreement is reached will creditors unlock the final 7.2 billion euros, a tranche of bailout funds. The latest Greek proposals are believed to include new taxes on businesses and the wealthy, selective increases in the value-added tax, savings and pensions linked to curbing early retirement and increasing pension contributions, no further reductions in pensions or public sector wages, red lines for Greece's Syriza government. And then, friends, the caption with this photograph that's part of this story reads, Greek pensioners fear being hit further by austerity measures. But German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble said a deal was not close. I get the impression that we haven't come much further than we were on Monday, he said. But we are just beginning, then we'll see. In any case, the preparations that were made do not make one optimistic that we will find a solution today, end quote. The week ahead proffers a tight schedule. Tomorrow and Friday, Thursday and Friday, finance ministers put the finishing touches to a debt deal if reached. Then, scheduled meetings of all 28 EU member states. Any agreement could receive lenders' backing here. Saturday through Tuesday, agreement will need to be approved by the Greek Parliament and other Eurozone governments, including a vote in the German Bundestag. Tuesday, June 30, is the deadline for Greek repayment of 1.6 billion euros to the IMF. And then, friends, the Queen now today is traveling around Europe, and she speaks of a need for unity in Europe. The caption of this opening photograph reads, "The Queen is in Germany with the Duke of Edinburgh," or the Duke of Edinburgh, on a 4-day state visit. The Queen has spoken of the need for unity in Europe in a speech to German and UK leaders. The UK monarch, who was at a state banquet in Berlin as part of a 4-day visit to Germany, said that division in Europe is dangerous. Her speech was made in the presence of German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Prime Minister David Cameron, who wants to reform the UK's EU membership. Buckingham Palace stressed the comments were not about Mr. Cameron's EU aims. Ms. Merkel and Mr. Cameron earlier met for talks ahead of an EU summit in Brussels. The Queen, who as head of the state remains politically neutral in Bellevue Palace, the official residence of Germany's President Joachim Gauck, in our lives, we have seen the worst, but also the best of our continent. We have witnessed how quickly things can change for the better, but we know that we must work hard to maintain the benefits of post-war world. We know that division in Europe is dangerous and that we must guard against it in the West as well as in the East of our continent. That remains a common endeavor, end quote. Later, a Buckingham Palace aide said, "This is not about the EU. The Queen is apolitical. She would never make a political point." And then the caption with this next photograph featuring the Queen says, "The banquet was hosted by Germany's President Joachim Gauck," who you see pictured on the right side of the picture. The aide said the Queen had been referring to risk of wider differences dividing the continent. Mr. Gauck said in his banquet speech that the EU needed the UK and it would support a, quote, constructive dialogue on the reforms Mr. Cameron wanted. He said the EU was facing major challenges and that an effective European Union was based on a stable foundation of shared values. A constructive dialogue on the reforms Britain wants to see is therefore essential, he said. As a good partner, Germany will support this dialogue. For Britain, it's part of Europe. For Britain is part of Europe. The European Union needs Britain. A united Europe, a strong European Union represents stability, peace, and freedom for us all, he said. Mr. Cameron has said he wants to reform the UK's membership of the EU before holding an in-out referendum in 2017. And then, friends, here's an important piece of news related to what's been happening in the news in the past few days, weeks, and months, and going back a couple of years even. But more recently, China has been doing something in these islands very aggressively. A group of islands in the South China Sea may not sound particularly significant, but these recently formed pieces of land could be the key to Beijing's future military strategy. I suspect that until a few weeks ago, the South China Sea was not a place most people around the world gave much thought to or any thought at all. The Spratly Islands, even less so. Unless you are a China geek, you've probably hardly heard of them. But Google Spratly Islands today, and you will find a sudden deluge of articles all proclaiming the same sort of sentiment. China and the U.S. are on a collision course, and it could end in war, this opening story says. Could it? Probably not anytime soon anyway, but what's going on in the South China Sea is still very significant. This, of course, is all about China, or rather China's intentions. For the best part of 2 millennia, China was made the dominant power in Asia. But then along came European expansion and the Industrial Revolution and the arrival on China's shores of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and of course eventually the British. China was brought to its knees, carved up its palaces, burned, its people hooked on opium supplied by Britain. Then came a revolution, a civil war, a world war, another revolution, and 30 years of Maoist madness. Now, finally, is China emerging from these 2 centuries of chaos. It is once again wealthy, united, and strong. None of us really knows what that will mean. One reason is that China's secretive Communist Party leadership never tells anybody its intentions. And so we're left to read the China tea leaves. look at what China is doing and try to work out its intentions. And so that brings me to the South China Sea. The southern part of it, close to the Philippines, is dotted with treacherous coral reefs, rocks, and sandbars. Only a handful are big enough to be called islands. China, Vietnam, and the Philippines have been quarreling over who owns them for decades. But last year there was a sudden and dramatic change. Aerial photos taken by the Philippine Navy showed a fleet of dredgers anchored off one of the Chinese-controlled reefs. They were seen pumping millions of tons of material onto the reefs to form an artificial island. A media frenzy ensued in which I played my own small part. I think I have a fair claim to being the first Western journalist to see the strange new Chinese islands with my own eyes, the author of this news story reports. And the caption with this next photograph in this story, friends, reads, "Ships at Mischief Reef in the Spratly Islands." And the author says, "Last year I set out on a Filipino fishing boat to try to find them. One morning, plowing through a heavy swell 300 nautical miles off the Philippine coast, we suddenly saw land ahead where my chart said there should not have been any. Even the latest Philippine Navy flights had not detected any work on this particular reef. But there it was, a brand new yellowish piece of land at a place called Gavin Reef." This year, China's work on the island has accelerated dramatically. More than 2,000 acres of new land has been created on 6 reefs. In April, fresh photos showed the outlines of a runway beginning to be laid on one of those islands. So what is China up to? Some pro-Beijing scholars have tried to claim the islands are for both military and civilian use. There will be lighthouses and shelters for fishermen, they say. Well, maybe. But Beijing is not spending billions of dollars on huge land reclamation hundreds of miles from its own coast to help fishermen. These islands are military and strategic. China is alone in claiming the whole of the South China Sea. Now it is creating facts on the ground. That runway is not for tourist flights. A few weeks ago, a U.S. surveillance plane deliberately flew close to the new islands. The crew recorded the immediate and angry Chinese response. "Foreign military aircraft. This is China Navy," the operator announced. "You are approaching our military alert zone. Leave immediately." The warning was repeated with growing irritation until the radio operator was left sputtering, "You go!" There is nothing in international law that says China can build islands on submerged reefs far from its own shore and then declare them military no-go zones. But that is not stopping Beijing from doing so. And so, that question arises again. What is China's intention? Does it really intend to use these islands to try to enforce its claim to the whole of the South China Sea? Will it really try to exclude other militaries, including the U.S., from entering these waters and airspace? If so, there is going to be trouble. So you've got plenty from our stories tonight to have something to be praying for today, friends. And because you got plenty, I want to end on a light one for tonight. We've got a story that I think especially some of you, well, anybody who's a cat lover will and can appreciate. Love this story. A young boy had a lucky escape when a neighbor's dog attacked him while the child was playing on his bike. The family cat pounced on the dog and chased him off. Katie Hastings has this closing report.
You'd normally think a dog was a man's best friend, but in this case, a boy in America would definitely call his pet cat his saviour. CCTV captured the boy playing on his bicycle when a neighbour's dog grabs him and grips him by the leg. Moments later, the family cat, named Tara, leaps into action and tackles the dog, which promptly runs away. The boy from Bakersfield in California needed stitches to his leg, but is recovering while in hospital. Katie Hastings, BBC News.
All right, friends, I thought you might enjoy something light that we could end with tonight. And that's it for this Wednesday night report. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow night, Thursday night, with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy right here on Nightcast. Until next time, your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.